Good God, Herle Burlyites, it's time for another episode of the podcast. And I'm here with a good friend of the pod, maybe the best friend of the pod, Frances Donald. I say that because Miss Donald is officially setting a record today with her third appearance here on the Herle Burly. Now, if I'm being completely transparent, Scott Reed and Jenny Byrne have each been on the program well over 100 times. But those two were so loud, so profane, so questionably informed that we had to banish them to a whole other podcast called The Curse of Politics. Ms. Donald, on the other hand, has always been a goddamn delight. As our listeners know, she is the Managing Director, Global Chief Economist, Global Head of Macroeconomic Strategy, and Cartoon Watcher at Manulife Investment. Today is all about the economy, as you might expect having a Global Chief Economist on the program. Is inflation happening or not happening? We'll talk about the impact of climate change on the economy and the state of the economy generally. Frances Donald, it's fantastic to welcome you back to the Herle Burly. How are you?
I'm excited. This is the highlight of my week. Thank you for having me back.
Oh my God. Normally you have big weeks. Okay, so this is the highlight. Let's do it. Hey, how's Montreal? I was there on the weekend for a football game, and boy, Waze makes its money in Montreal, getting around that city between the construction and the roads and the.
Right. Oh no, the key to Montreal is you have to just stay in your home. If you leave your house, you're probably not getting back to it. So you just got to factor in a bigger timeline around it. That's the way. But actually, I love being in Montreal. And one of the little delights I was telling my husband yesterday is that there's so much to do within 45 minutes of Montreal that you can go on all these day trips and go up to different mountains and all these different activities. Whereas in Toronto, 45 minutes, you're halfway up the DVP, you're not getting anywhere. So it's been really liberating to live in a city that doesn't feel as like landlocked by a strange highway system. And I'm really, really happy to be here. I've enjoyed the transition quite a bit.
Yeah, it's a great city. It's really a great city. And for Terry's sake, I swung up to St. Viateur and got some bagels. Brought them back.
Clutch. I also made myself a St. Viateur bagel this morning, but as I was telling you before the show, my dog literally ate it. So it's coffee for now, and then we'll have to reevaluate after we chat.
Excellent. Okay, let's talk some economics. I want to talk about inflation, but before we talk about inflation, can you give us sort of an overview? How does the economy look? How is the global economy and the Canadian economy coming out of the pandemic?
Well, that depends entirely who you are, Dave. Because for some people, it's going absolutely fantastic. And if you look at the headline data across, so just the aggregate data that averages out every province, we've got jobs that are back to pre-COVID levels. We're just about back on GDP. If you ask the Bank of Canada, we couldn't possibly be doing any better. Fiscal support now feels like it can pull back. It looks like in many ways, the COVID recession is behind us. I think that's a little bit of a trap. For two reasons. The first is that for many Canadians, particularly those who do not have university degrees, those who have small children who still experience disruptions of having to get COVID tests or pull their children from school, those whose savings were substantially depleted, those who are now priced out of a housing market, those who are still were receiving federal assistance but have not yet been rehired by airlines or so-and-so, we're still in a really difficult economic situation. Now, it's not uncommon for our economies to be very, segregated in terms of who's benefiting and who's not. But this recovery has really been for homeowners and those with stock portfolios, and it has been less for those who really were hit hardest by COVID. Now, the second reason that I'm a little bit nervous of saying all is clear is because as we look forward into 2022, we're now moving away from that initial period where we all had pent up demand for things. Like you mentioned, you went to Montreal. I went on my first little family trip. We went to Montebello. It's a lovely little place. I remember the first week I had 3 restaurant meals. Now I don't think I've had a restaurant meal in 3 weeks. And our pent-up demand has really come back. We no longer have those CERB checks or other forms of assistance, but we're seeing a massive pullback in government spending. In fact, we're going to see the massive global contraction in what we call fiscal stimulus, the biggest year-over-year decline since the 1940s. And then we have this pesky, I should say not little, massive problem, which is the Chinese economy. You may remember China was the first to deal with the COVID crisis, shut down its country, which was the beginning of supply chain disruptions. And now we've had 2 months in a row of China's economy actually contracting on the manufacturing side. They are still pursuing COVID zero policies. Now, for many of us who are looking at inventories and thinking, wait, am I going to get all my Christmas presents done? Yeah, do it now, because we're still looking at these rolling supply chain disruptions. And then on top of that, we have what you said, inflation. But I don't think about inflation as much as, oh, higher prices, therefore higher interest rates. And we could spend 45 minutes talking about that. We probably will. What I see around me is that higher prices actually make our lives as Canadians more difficult. They mean we either don't get the things that we want because they cost more. We buy less of the things that we want. Or for many Canadians, we have to make really tough decisions. Fill up the gas tank, make rent. What are we buying for groceries this week? Inflation is a very damaging growth development. And traditionally, when we had higher inflation, it didn't come with that slower growth profile, but that's the concern going into 2022. So right now, the recovery has occurred across our data. But as we look into 2022, I am by nature a cautious individual. I'm not yet there on saying everything is fine, because there's going to be a lot of speed bumps. And in some cases, I think some ongoing painful developments that occur in 2022.
Okay, well, a lot there. Thank you. Let's start with jobs. The government, as you said, kind of abruptly ended the income support system that had replaced the CERB. Was it the CRB?
CERB or CRB had variations.
Yeah. And is that because the jobs are back and people weren't taking them as the small business community was claiming? Or why did the government withdraw that now?
Okay, so first of all, here is the plight of the Canadian economist. We don't have super great data that tells us the why behind things all the time, so we pontificate. We do have great data in the United States. And so we can extrapolate as to some of the reasons why there was labor shortages. Although in Canada, our labor force participation rate is actually back to pre-COVID levels. We just have sector mismatches. In the United States, the labor force participation rate is very depressed. Now, in the US, we had data that asked people, why are you not going back? And we can probably assume that it's similar. And there were 4 reasons that people talked about this. The number one reason that people were hesitant about going back to work, Dave, was not that they are lazy, because they were afraid of getting COVID. Is that such a terrible reason to not want to go back to work? They were afraid of getting COVID and either being in a critical condition themselves or giving it to somebody that they love. The second reason, and it's probably related, was government assistance. You're not put in a position where you have to choose between potentially endangering your mother who lives with you and making rent. So the government assistance allowed for you to bias your preference towards not wanting to be exposed to COVID. The third reason we can empirically demonstrate this was virtual schooling. Now, I'm really looking forward to seeing the data over the years of the Ontario versus Quebec approach to this, because we could demonstrate repeatedly that women particularly, but some men, my husband is the stay-at-home parent in my family. I'm not going to generalize all women, but parents in particular, and especially women with children under the age of 12, we repeatedly saw that when children went to virtual schooling, they either reduced the total number of hours they were working, which was more of a Canadian response, or they chose not to go back to work. It was my son's birthday party in September. I invited 8 children to play outside. Spider-Man came. It was a very big deal, highlight of everyone's life. I invited 8 children. 4 of them could not come because they had COVID. All from different areas of Montreal could not attend the party. And 2 out of those 4 kids' moms said, I was thinking about going back to work. I'm just not going to do it until I have some stability, effectively. And the 4th reason, which is perhaps one of the most important secular shifts that we've experienced, is actually early retirement. So we've seen particularly women, but also everyone 55 plus say, you know what? Stock portfolio, all-time high. Housing prices doing damn all right. I can take out a HELOC, give that to my kids or my grandkids. Maybe you're at the age where you're taking care of both your grandkids and the elderly. You can actually say, I can take retirement. This is a really beneficial environment for that. So it's not as simple as government assistance. In fact, I would say government assistance was appropriate length to get people over that hump. But as we head into this new period, it's not so much that we're going to see, millions of Canadians who need a CERB check that don't have one. It's that this was pushing a lot of money into the real economy, and that's going to disappear. And if you took econ and you suffered through that, you might remember there are 2 types of policy: monetary policy and fiscal policy. And when you have both contracting at the same time, it's a double whammy on how fast your economy can accelerate. Now, there's going to be proponents who say, but Francis, we're not in a crisis anymore. We shouldn't have crisis level spending. And that's true. But we have to be careful that we remove that very slowly. It's like having a giant balloon. You don't go in and stab it with the scissors. Maybe you do, Dave. You look like the cut. Just go at it like
I'm
that.
A killer.
Yeah, just get it out. I like to gently nick the top of it so that it slowly deflates. Also, so that my child doesn't run in and go, why are you deflating my balloons? But this is how you should be removing policy, right? Very quietly and slowly, so as not to create a cacophony of crisis, right? So as we go into 2022, this is what I'm watching is, can we slowly remove it? That seems to be happening much better on the fiscal side than it is on the monetary side. So as I said, we don't have the same rate breakdown in Canadian data, but we can extrapolate. There's a lot more going on here than just people didn't want to go to work because they were getting $2,000 a month. No, that's not the story.
Right. Sometimes I think of Canada as a hand-knit cardigan. Hang in there, Herle Burlyites. I'm going somewhere with this. The 8 or 9 buttons on the cardigan represent our large city centers. The thousands of stitches that hold the whole thing together, they're our rural communities. But we have a problem right now with those stitches. They're unraveling. Too many rural communities are being hollowed out because they don't have anywhere near adequate high-speed digital connectivity. The good people who live in these places can't do business. They can't farm their land with the latest technology. They can't access the education and healthcare they need. In some cases, they can't even upload a photo or make a cell phone call. And so, they leave. It's a problem that our presenting sponsor, TELUS, wants to fix by investing in spectrum to help rural Canadians connect. Spectrum is the radio waves that make your cell phone, GPS systems, and Wi-Fi work. The federal government licenses spectrum to companies who are expected to use it to provide service. But far too many of our rural communities have had their spectrum controlled by regional carriers who'd rather sit on it and then resell it for millions in profit than actually use it to help those communities thrive. Regional does not mean small. These are multi-billion-dollar companies who benefit from billions in government spectrum subsidies. And they use less than 20% of the rural spectrum they hold. TELUS has the strongest track record of deploying its rural spectrum. Almost 2/3 of theirs is put to use, with more to come. As a technology leader with a social purpose, TELUS believes you should use your spectrum or you should lose it. Full stop. And they are committed to doing the work in partnership with governments to help end the digital divide in this country. Go to telus.com/connectingcanada to learn more. Can we talk about inflation? I want to really get into this so that people understand it because it's becoming a very significant political issue. And so if people are going to talk about it in politics, I want them to understand as much as they can about the actual content of it. So can we start by defining it? And when I say defining it, It feels to me like there is a disconnect between the way the Bank of Canada measures it and the way consumers feel it. So, are we measuring the right things? And when we talk about the inflation rate, what are we precisely talking about?
I'm so excited. How long do we have? I feel inflation is one of the most misunderstood concepts, but particularly, we're not all talking about the same thing. And that is a problem because we're often comparing apples to oranges and we're getting in fights because we're actually discussing very different stories. So where to start here? So when we talk about the current inflation that we're experiencing in our lives, and I want to be really clear, there is a very big difference between the price pressures that you and I and our fellow Canadians feel in our very real life and what mathematical Bank of Canada CPI data, Consumer Price Index data, is going to say. I want to make a t-shirt so badly that says CPI math is not real life. Okay? Inflation data is not real life. It serves a different type of purpose, but it's not intended to capture our individual experiences, nor will it ever do that. So bank economists and other economists like myself are going to say things, and I'll walk you through why that is, like inflation is going to slow a lot in 2022. They're not telling you that your cost of living is going to decline. So why is that? What is the difference between it? So first things first, in our current economy, the inflation that we as Canadians are feeling is coming from three different pockets, okay? Three different things. The first element, about 80% of the inflation that we feel, is coming from supply side disruptions, the supply side of the economy. That is largely port closures, backups in containers in LA, our inability to get things. Now, this is coming in part from a little bit of
So that's why lumber costs soared for a period of time and then declined. That's
exactly
not a shortage of lumber. That was a difficulty in getting it here.
Did we suddenly run out of trees in British Columbia? No, we didn't. We didn't suddenly. It's not like trees magically disappeared. What's the Avengers movie where Thanos snaps his fingers and half the population is gone? That did not happen to Canadian lumber, okay? What happened was there was a lot of demand for it, but there was COVID outbreaks and manufacturing plants couldn't process it, and there was truck driver shortages, which couldn't bring it somewhere. Now, this happened on a grand scale across the entire world, and critically, Dave, this is the most important thing I could say. It was global and supply side. Now, on top of that, we have these exacerbating supply side issues, which is that there are some pretty sizable droughts happening around the world. When we have droughts, we have higher food prices that come through. And then we have these other political developments like Brexit and ongoing elevated tariffs between the US and China. So about 80% of what's happening is global and supply side. You and I, when we took our economics classes, really learned about the economy from the demand. Are you laughing because you never took an economics class? Or you're just trying you have PTSD?
I did take economics. I'm not sure I really ever fundamentally made it past curves of indifference, but
you know what?
Indifference
Econ
curves,
101 is not as valuable in this type of environment anyway, so don't worry about it. In any case, when we took our econ classes, we were largely taught about seeing the economy through the demand side. That if you and I wanted fitness equipment, we could buy it and we would boost the economy by doing that, right? But what happened in the past year and a half was the supply side of the economy got seriously restrained because of a global pandemic that limited our ability to actually get the stuff. And that's ongoing. Why is it ongoing? Well, some of it is weather. Some of it is that China is still pursuing COVID zero policies, probably until the Olympics in February. So every time they have a small outbreak, they shut it down. Did you see that Disneyland in China, they had one case and they shut down all of Disneyland and they're quarantining all these individuals, okay? Every time that happens in a plant, our Christmas presents, our holiday presents get restrained. The second area of inflation is a little bit less and is already coming down, and that's what we call the reopening inflation. That's when you and I and every other Canadian could finally go out and get our haircuts, go to dinner. I went to a movie for the first time in 2 years. So we had all this pent-up demand, so we were flooding into these areas, and suddenly there was a demand-supply mismatch in areas that weren't hit by the supply side as much. The first restaurant I went to, I tweeted about it, I was so excited. I went and I said, I'll take the fried pickles. And the waitress looked at me and she said, we actually didn't get pickles because of the supply side disruptions, which was like dagger to my heart, right? That's all I wanted the whole pandemic was the fried pickles. So that was a lot of demand pushing into reopening. Now, we have actually come down on the
And your waiter is talking about supply chain disruptions?
Of course. What Canadian doesn't know about supply side disruptions? We all know this is happening, right? We're all feeling it in different ways. We all know that, right? So that's the second type of inflation. That's already starting to cool a little bit, but in Canada, it's happening a little bit later because we've actually been locked down for longer and we have more pent-up demand to go do these things, these services-based activities that we wanted to do. The third type of inflation is the one we really want to pay attention to. And that's what we're going to call stickier long-term inflation. Now, these trends are probably going to take a couple of years to create inflation in the system, and they include things like wage growth. Minimum wage increases, for example. We are seeing some wage growth as labor demands more from their employees in this type of environment. Deglobalization trends. I'm sure you've had many guests on your podcast who have talked about the need to be more self-sufficient in Canada. But if we do that, costs are going to rise a little bit. Did you know there's a Club Med going in Charlevoix, Quebec? Did you know this? I may or may not have booked 3 days for myself. It's not a beach resort, Dave. It's a ski resort, Club Med. And my husband and I were looking at this, and I was saying, it's amazing they had a 50% off sale, but 3 days in Club Med Charlevoix is the same price as 7 days for us to go to a Club Med in Mexico. Which one do we want to do? Well, of course, because of COVID restrictions and PCR tests and all this, we elected for the more local option, but it costs more for less, right? That's Club Med, but we're going to see this across a range of different developments, particularly as we have a preference. That creates some inflation. And then, of course, we have shelter inflation and house price inflation. That's stickier and more domestic. Now, the reason that I break this down into three separate parts is because...
You didn't mention energy.
So energy, we're going to take out a little bit because it fluctuates quite aggressively, and or I'm going to put it in the supply side. Okay, because why are energy prices so high? In large part because we have an OPEC supply issue. So we'll categorize that a little bit into supply and a little bit into reopening, because now we have a lot of people who are trying to go on vacations, and we do see a little bit move up in energy, right? But typically energy is so volatile that we strip it out of the conversation, which is not to say it doesn't impact us, because if you have to fill up your gas or you're heating your house with natural gas, very important. So the reason that I say there are three types of inflation is because the predominant response to this inflation we're seeing in the system is we must hike interest rates, right? This is what we hear all the time. The solution to this is to hike interest rates. Tell me, Dave, how are hiking Canadian interest rates going to open ports in China? How is hiking Canadian interest rates going to make it rain in Brazil? Reverse Brexit. Suddenly make it so that there are more workers in LA ports. You cannot use domestic interest rate policy to impact global supply side developments. It's not going to function. And then we have, the second component, which is reopening. So the reopening is temporary. We know that it's already showing signs of pulling back. Interest rate policy works with a long lag. It takes 18 months to 24 months. My first job was at the Bank of Canada. I don't know if you know this. That is an actual interview question that I got. I was like 21 years old, and I was asked, how long does it take for monetary policy to impact the economy? So I know that every person who works there knows the answer to that question. It takes 1.5 to 2 years. So you don't target current problem that you know is temporary with a solution that will take 2 years. Now, it is true that housing very interest rate sensitive, and you do want to make sure that you're not overly penalizing that. The challenge that I have is that when we talk about inflation, unfortunately, we as Canadians don't have a lot of control over the inflation we're seeing in the system, and we don't have a lot of ability to know when the supply side has come back. I know that economists and like weathermen are often compared, but I don't know when it's going to rain in Brazil. I don't know that. I don't know when Beijing is going to decide to move back away from COVID zero policies, and neither does the Bank of Canada. We know when we ask via survey data that a lot of the manufacturers tell us that they're seeing mild improvements in the last 2 months, but it's going to take 2022 for these supply side issues to clear. At which point, we're going to have a lot of stuff that has been unloaded from container freights. We're going to have commodity prices that come back down. We're already seeing this in iron ore. Look at the Baltic Dry Index. It's one of the best indices to look at what's going on in the commodity space. It's collapsing now. So these pressures are going to come off. Now, some central banks, like the European Central Bank, have said it's not the responsibility of central banks to respond to supply chain disruptions, and we shouldn't overreact. Now, why is that? Because what you're going to do if you try to tackle inflation that interest rate policy can't control is you're going to sacrifice growth. You're going to make it so that the family who already has higher food prices and higher energy prices now has a more expensive mortgage or can't buy that house that they thought they were going to have, or their line of credit goes up right at that critical moment where fiscal support is falling out and the economy is just starting to get a little bit more attention. So you're going to try to tackle inflation now and sacrifice growth later. Now, are you a yield curve man, Dave? I don't know. You have a look about you. Maybe you're a yield curve man.
No, I'm more of a stop curve man. I don't yield.
Okay. So here's the thing. In the bond market, you have an interest rate across many maturities. How much does it cost to borrow money for 2 years, 10 years, 30 years, and a couple maturities in between? Now, what we've seen the Canadian bond market and global bond market do in response to a Bank of Canada that has effectively said they want to tackle this global supply side inflation with domestic interest rate policy is the 2-year yield, which basically tells you how much they expect interest rates to rise in the next 2 years, has shot up very dramatically. Long-term yields, which tell us where the economy is going to be in 10 to 30 years, have fallen. That's called a yield curve flattener. That's the yield curve flattening. That tends to happen before recessions. Now, are we going into a recession? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the bond market is telling you that if you try to tackle inflation now, you will sacrifice growth later. That is the current challenge with the type of inflation that we're seeing. So in general, that's how I think about it. Now, when you do CPI math, this is a whole different thing. Remember that CPI math, Consumer Price Index, is always year over year. So it's measuring today's inflation versus last year's inflation. So for example, if it costs $100 to buy groceries a week last year, and then it's $120 this year, inflation was 20%. That would be how you do it. Now, if inflation then goes to 121 and change or 22 and change, you would say that we're back to 2% inflation, because 20 to 22, I don't know the exact math, I should have done it before, is now a year-over-year change that's very small. But you're still paying $22 more than you were 2 years earlier, right? So your year-over-year is how we measure inflation. We don't tend to measure it in level terms. And this is why I say CPI math is not real life. As we go into 2022, what we're going to see is that compared to 2021, inflation is going to be lower. So the year over year is going to go back towards 2%, even though our lives will still be substantially more expensive than they were 2 years ago. You're not going to see an unwinding of most things. Some things, used cars, they'll be less expensive, so that'll be a year-over-year decline. But our cost of living has risen very dramatically in 2 years, and we're going to see inflation slow to below 2% in 2022, but our cost of living will still be much higher than 2 years earlier. The other issue with CPI math is that it takes a different time periods for different factors to affect it. So economists spend a lot of time saying, okay, how long does it take for higher energy prices to filter through into inflation data? That's actually a pretty quick one. Shelter, housing, actually takes a lot longer to filter through. In the United States, house price increases can take up to 2 years before they show up in the CPI data. So it's up to the economist to know that the video game that is CPI and be able to measure when each one of these impacts comes through. And this is why a lot of us are looking around us and saying home prices are, skyrocketing, but shelter inflation in Canadian CPI is only at 5%. How is that possible? Give it time. I was looking up, do you know the town that has the highest house price appreciation? 80% increase over COVID. Do you know what it is? I had to look it up. Bancroft, Ontario. Do you know Bancroft? I looked it up. Here's the title on the website.
I do.
Okay, so it says Bancroft is located in the heart of Ontario, tucked away from the bustle of the big city, but close enough to visit. Central to several mid-sized cities. Oh, that sounds lovely. Perfect for COVID. 80% increase in home prices. The second one was Tillsonburg, Ontario. Apparently, it's known for
tobacco country.
The popular summer. Yeah, so you know what this is. Okay, I'm not a Ontario. In Tillsonburg, they have a Turtle Fest, the popular summer festival that brings thousands of people to our community for Father's Day. These are the places that are seeing 60 to 80% increases. But the people who live in Tillsonburg and Bancroft will still be told that inflation is running around 4 to 5%. So there is a very big difference between how we measure these things and what we feel in our life. But the main takeaway that I can say here is that we have to be really careful about thinking that the cure for the inflation we see right now is higher interest rates. I don't think that's going to be very effective in materially changing the costs that you and I and so many Canadians feel. What will be effective is when ports reopen, labor goes back into a variety of major cities, we see it rain. These are the things that are going to help prices decline. And it sucks to say it, but it's not under our control.
Well, recent history has taught us what happens when a government or a business slashes spending in order to achieve a quick bump in the bottom line. The folly is encapsulated in that word, slash, meaning to cut with rough, jerky, sweeping strokes. The immediate result might look good on a balance sheet or give the share price a sugar high, but that doesn't usually last. Slashing generally creates other problems, safety issues, equipment breakdowns, workforce issues. It becomes a game of whack-a-mole, new problems erupting with every short-term fix. That's not to say spending shouldn't be adjusted from time to time and business plans altered. Our sponsor, CN, is in the process of doing just that. Yes, it's carrying out some cuts, but they are judicious and targeted and meant to improve service to customers in an already hyper-competitive market. The railway will continue to invest in safety, in technology, and in capacity, because it knows that is the only way to remain an industry leader in the years ahead. At the same time, CN's strategic plan will deliver immediate value to shareholders. It is, in short, a growth plan, and it has already shown results. Revenues were up in the third quarter of this year, and investors have reacted positively. We are living through a time of rapid, profound change. The pandemic has mercilessly exposed the fragility of the overseas supply chains we've all become used to. It's a pretty safe bet. Governments and manufacturers are going to want shorter, more stable chains in the years ahead. There is simply no better way to accomplish that than shipping by rail. CN's 19,000-mile network connects our Atlantic coast to the Pacific and stretches down through the American heartland to the Gulf of Mexico. There are no choke points or weak links. CN, in other words, is perfectly positioned to grow. It's building the railway of the future, not the past. So wait a second. Let me just interject here. I want to be clear. You are saying to me the political critique in Canada has been that the government and the Bank of Canada have been fueling inflation through large deficit spending, through the printing of money and quantitative easing, and through the Bank of Canada buying government bonds, that the combination of those things is creating inflation in Canada. You are telling me that that is not correct.
That is not where the vast majority of inflation that we are feeling is currently coming from. And you can measure that empirically.
Okay, well, that's a very qualified answer. That wouldn't shut down Pierre Poilievre. Because you had a couple of qualifiers in there.
Well, because there's never, what we say is that most of the inflation is global and supply side driven. There is some demand element. As I said, if we're all, if people who otherwise would have been without CERB checks, they would be in dire depression-like states right now, would probably not be going out to restaurants because they have pent-up demand for it. But the vast majority of the inflation we see in the system is still COVID distortions created by global developments. Now, the other thing that people seem to miss on this story is that we are not the only ones with 4 to 5% inflation. The US is also experiencing this. This is a global inflationary push higher. We tend to say, is QE responsible for OPEC? Did the Bank of Canada policy change global demand for energy or natural gas? Does QE affect weather? Does our federal deficit impact China's COVID zero policy? These are the primary sources. Now, it's likely that large fiscal spending, particularly if it's in the right areas, does support higher inflation over time. But first of all, it takes a long time for fiscal money to impact your economy. 3 to 8 years, the IMF has a paper on that. That's how long it takes. So even if you wanted to argue to me that the deficit was what's creating major inflation here, then you would have to say in 2023. And then I would say, yes, I think you're correct that there's some inflationary pressure happening there. And this is why there is some merit in saying we're no longer in a crisis. We should move back on some of this extraordinary spending. I don't like seeing what we're seeing in the housing market right now. I don't like worrying about will we be able to spend in future crises? What if we hit another black swan event in 2 years? Can we blow out our deficit more? But these are global developments. They're not Canadian developments. They weren't created by Canadian policymakers. And worse, ask the question, what would have happened if we didn't do that? And the rest of the world were supporting its workers and making sure they were Canada be the only major developed market in a depression? What do you want? Mass unemployment? Or, the need to restrain over time? But again, the key component here is coming back to the balloon metaphor, which is that you don't want to pop these things really quickly. You have to give people time to adjust. You want to deflate them slowly over time. That's happening on the fiscal front, less so on the monetary front.
So is there anything the government can do about these supply side disruptions? I mean, I hear about our ports being clogged, et cetera, because, the cost of living, as I said, is becoming a real political issue. And it's not really politically acceptable for the government to throw up its hands and say, China, I don't know what to do about it. So the government's going to feel a need to respond. Can it respond?
Sure. And the federal government is probably in a better position to do that than asking interest rates to do that. So that's ensuring that you can subsidize or encourage labor as much as possible in those industries that would help ease supply chains, providing support in those areas, and also asking what can we do to improve kind of trade and movement within the country? What about interprovincial trade barriers? That would be a place that you could start that would really substantially help that. No? Did I upset you? Do I get to come back and forth?
Well, I mean, fuck. I mean, I'm 59. Francis, we've been talking about that as long as I've been sentient. That is not happening.
Why do you think we're talking about it? Because it's so critical to the functioning of the Canadian economy. So if you're asking me, you didn't ask me what will the government do. You said what should the government do? Okay? It's a very different question. The federal government is in a better position to try to arrange the free flowing of goods and services across the country and encouraging labor than interest rate policy, particularly because it seems that the next step for interest rate policy is to tighten. So what are we going to do? We're going to tighten the costs for businesses across Canada, reduce the ability to take on credit right when we're in the ongoing middle of a business crisis. That's going to be more challenging to do that, right? So yes, you need to be focusing on how do we ensure free flowing goods and services? How do we help companies across Canada have domestic supply chains so that they're not disrupted in the event that we see future challenges, right? How do we make sure that I know that there's this really big focus on diversifying global trade over time, and that's good. You can have dual or triple supply chains, but there is going to be, we know this, we feel this, there's going to be a focus on how do we actually make sure we're more self-sufficient as an economy? Because we don't want to have to be importing all of our food. We don't want to have to be importing all of our intermediary goods because there are going to be global supply side shocks that happen. particularly in this new post-COVID environment where we're so much more health conscious to where we were before. So if we're going to have policies that mean we restrict tourism because you have to get so many tests, I got to go to the US next week for work, my first major trip. I am panicked about the testing system. Where do I get the PCR test when I'm in the US? What if it doesn't come back? It's actually restraining my desire to do that. And for sure, it's restraining other areas. So if we're going to have these limitations on our economy, we also have to have the offsetting supports that exist. And the Canadian government was really good about this in the depth of the crisis with lockdowns and CERB checks, et cetera. But now it has to be extended to the business community on a more structural timeline.
Okay, really interesting. Can I nerd out about the Bank of Canada for a second?
I do that every day.
Despite your advice, the bank is signaling that it intends to start raising interest rates. Some banks think they're going to raise interest rates a lot, consistently over the next few years. There has been some discussion about the bank's mandate, and the bank itself has been holding consultations about whether or not it should change its mandate. And one of the ideas is that, I think the United States has this, that it should, right now, it has one mandate: keep inflation
one
between
job,
a band
like
of 1 and 3.
Yeah.
One job. Inflation between 1 and 3%. Yeah. And some people say it should have 2. Keep inflation low and keep employment high. And if it had a dual mandate, would it be viewing the current situation differently than it is currently viewing it?
Yeah. So every major bank in Canada expects the Bank of Canada to raise rates and has generally been encouraging them to do so. So for your listeners, I am an outlier and I'm aware of it. So let's just start there. I know that I have a different view on the Bank of Canada, and I am alone in my corner with a few exceptions to that. So the Bank of Canada has one mandate: price stability, inflation between 1 and 3%, with 2% as the midpoint. So they differ even on that, because other central banks will have 2% target as inflation. Now, the Federal Reserve has a different mandate: price stability and full employment. And they actually expanded that to be broad-based and inclusive employment. So they've widened even their definition of what employment is. There are many central banks that have employment mandates that go along with them. And then there are central banks that actually have these additional, like, kind of not ghost, but tertiary mandates. Like, so in the United States, risk and regulation falls under the central bank. In New Zealand, New Zealand is actually always the innovator in the central bank activity. They were the first to go with price stability, for example. They have housing affordability goes into their mandate effectively on the side. So a lot of central banks have a more expansive mandate than inflation alone. But it isn't just what your defined mandate is. It's how mechanically you approach it. And this is one of the big differences that we've seen from the Bank of Canada and many other central banks. So, we talked about how inflation is a year-over-year calculation. Basically, if last year was 10% inflation and this year is 2% inflation, then most central banks will say we're only focused on now, and last year doesn't matter. Bygones are bygones. So old inflation no longer matters to future policy. But last year, the Federal Reserve in the United States wanted to take a different approach. And they said, we're going to engage in average inflation targeting, which means that if we undercut inflation for 10 years, we're going to allow inflation to actually exceed so that the level over time matches, so that your cost of living over a 10-year or 20-year is more stable than just a 1-year type of perspective. The Bank of Canada hasn't done that, although
somehow that sounds like politics to me.
Well, I think the more I listen to your show, the more I realize everything is politics. The Bank of Canada didn't do that, but they said, well, we have this 1 to 3% band, so we already have an embedded flexibility within it. But there was a lot of focus on Governor Macklem over the past year to say, are you looking at something beyond inflation? And this has been less important in the past several decades, but this year is extraordinarily important because there is a big difference between growth and employment levels and inflation. If you have a dual mandate like the Federal Reserve, you have a lot more flexibility to stay easy in this environment because you can say, yes, inflation is too hot, but it's temporary. And we want to focus on getting the employment labor nice and hot so we can soak up the inequalities. This is what the Fed has done. Now, in addition to that, the Fed said something also very different from the Bank of Canada. The Federal Reserve said, and when we conduct policy, we're going to wait until we actually see what the data is. We're going to wait for the data to print on our screens before we respond to it. The Bank of Canada is conducting policy based on what they forecast will happen. So they also have reduced flexibility because not only do they have one target, but they're saying we're going to forecast where that's going to go, and we're going to act proactively instead of reactively. Now, that's a little bit harder because what if your forecasts are wrong? And this is why the Bank of Canada in the last month has been particularly interesting. The Bank of Canada is ruled by what we call the output gap. This is what their models tell us. Now, the output gap measures where you're going relative to your potential. Okay, so your potential is something that we try to measure. We don't really know what our economy is supposed to be growing. If everybody had a job and the companies were operating perfectly, what would our potential growth be? For a long time, our potential growth was 1.8%. So the Bank of Canada said all of the last 18 months, as soon as we grow at our potential, we will hike interest rates. Once we close that gap between where we are, it'd be like saying, if I get a C in my math test, my mom would say, once you get back to your A potential, Francis, then I will give you a prize. What happened in the last month was extraordinarily interesting because the Bank of Canada came out and they said, you know what? We actually got really hit by COVID and our potential is not 1.8, it's 1.6. And that's because we don't think CapEx businesses are going to spend as much as they will. We think that actually supply chain disruptions have had almost a permanent hit on how fast our economy could grow. So instead of our ability to grow at 1.8%, we probably think that instead of getting an A in class, we actually think our max potential is like a B. It's a 1.6%. And oh, look, we're going to hit that lower potential bar faster than 1.8. We're going to hit 1.6 earlier. We're going to hit it in the middle of 2022 so we can raise rates in 2022. So a lot of strategists kind of raised an eyebrow at that and said, so what you're effectively saying is that our economy is weaker post-COVID and you're revising down your growth expectations and how fast we're going to grow in the next few years. And therefore, we're going to raise interest rates. So this is why the growth component and the inflation component are not mutually exclusive. And the Bank of Canada is focusing on growth, but what they're saying is we need to have a good idea of what our potential is. Now, the somewhat hilarity that ensued over this period is that 2 days after the Bank of Canada made this announcement, we got August GDP. And August GDP came in weaker than expected. Instead of being closer to the 5% for Q3 that the Bank of Canada had estimated, it was going to be closer to 2%. So now all of a sudden, the Bank of Canada operating on forward-looking forecasts, their forecasts look way off. This is why some strategists like myself are saying, well, the Bank of Canada may have this optimistic outlook, but they're probably going to have to pull back on that in the next couple of months because growth isn't going to be as good as what they forecasted. Now, you're probably sitting there going, that's not what I asked, Francis. I asked, what should the mandate for the Bank of Canada be? Well, actually, it should probably be more, it's not that inflation is a bad mandate, but how we approach it and our way of calculating it probably needs to come with greater degrees of uncertainty. The challenge now is that every Canadian opened their newspaper this month and went, oh crap, interest rates are going to rise. That might be true, but it might not be true. We're playing with people's lives in really big ways. And the Bank of Canada knows this. They're doing the best that they can. But there's so much uncertainty as to what's going to happen in the next month that central banks who maybe say, we want to see the data actually print before we respond to it, that might be a more prudent approach going into next year. But that said, being a central banker is really hard. Criticizing the central bankers are easier. That's my job. So, we have to kind of approach it differently. I will tell you, there's a lot of feedback that CPI is not the right measure. Central banks are talking a lot more about climate change and inequalities, but I think the big, I was going to say meta, but that's a weird word lately with Facebook and such. The big meta problem with central banks is that we're asking central banks to do more than they're intended to do. We're asking central banks to help us deal with climate change and inequality. Interest rate policy is a blunt tool. Interest rates are not going to solve inequality. They're not going to solve education. They're not going to solve, centuries of suppression. We're not going to use interest rate policy to solve our climate transition. These are not issues that interest rate policy can affect. They have to fall towards the federal government, or we have to move towards more of a sort of market type of environment. Is it fair to say to central banks, actually, now you're responsible for all the things federal governments were responsible for? I don't think that's true either. So it's a little bit more expansive than just should it be inflation or something else. I think how you work around your inflation mandate might actually be more important than just what your mandate is.
Since Confederation, owning a home has been part of the Canadian dream. For most people, that dream is much more than just a monthly mortgage payment. A home is where we create our fondest memories and where we can truly be ourselves. For too many, especially young adults, that reality is out of reach and it's getting worse. The good news is our original sponsor, the Ontario Real Estate Association, or REA for short, has a plan to save the Canadian dream of home ownership. It includes lowering costs for first-time buyers, ending money laundering in the real estate market, and cutting years of red tape that is standing in the way of more affordable homes for families. The AREA plan will lay the foundation for a future where all people can find a place to call home. When we support the dreams of all of us who want to own a home, we're building healthier families, stronger communities, and a safer, more secure future for all. Read their plan at aurea.com/affordable homes. Okay, so I've only got time for one more question. So we're not going to get to delve into climate change the way I wanted to, but I'm going to link climate change to this. Are not all the countries in the world over in Glasgow right now promising to make energy more expensive for the next 40, 50 years? And isn't that going to be a major inflationary pressure ongoing as we replace plentiful and relatively inexpensive sources of energy with more expensive sources of energy? I don't hear the economic implications of that being discussed, but it feels to me like the drive to net zero is an inherently inflationary exercise.
It absolutely is, but it creates inflation in the long run. So again, this is something that we feel out 2024, 2025. There's another component to this, and this is trickier. So two things that mean, again, CPI math is not real life. First thing is, remember, our inflation data is year over year. So if a barrel of oil, what are we at today? I'll tell you. We are at, WTI barrel is $81. Brent is $82 today. If that rises to $90 next year, that's not going to be a big year over year increase. If it rises to 92 the next, won't be a big year over year increase. Now, compared to what we paid for gas 5-10 years ago, absolutely. And it's going to eat into our ability to purchase other things. But it's not going to show up in the inflation data because it will either be a one-time hit. So 1 year we have a big increase like this past year and then muddle along at high prices. In which case, if we go to $100 per barrel oil next year and then the subsequent year it's still at $100, guess how much inflation that is? 0%. CPI math is not real life. So when we look at the inflation statistics, that's one component, but it does hurt growth. This is the really big element of the story that I feel we're missing when we talk about inflation. We're so focused on, inflation is going to 5% and they should hike interest rates. And we're not thinking about what that inflation does to real people in their daily lives. Now, at the meantime, we're seeing extraordinarily high childcare costs, particularly in Ontario. We're seeing house prices that are rocketing and locking out entire generations from home purchases that make it extraordinarily expensive. Food prices are rising globally. That's going to continue to happen. These long-term subtle increases, what we're not seeing is the wage growth to match it. And this is the real story. When you talk about inflation, you always have to talk about inflation relative to wages. Because if prices go from $5 to $10, but my wage goes from $20 to $25, I don't really care. What we're looking for is what economists call real wage growth. So we have to make sure that we're seeing wage growth that rises in conjunction with the cost of living. You were talking about how earlier I was making breakfast for my kid, getting him to daycare, and simultaneously tweeting housing charts, which is true. And one of the charts that I tweeted was that the US is talking a lot about their really cute housing bubble. So cute, house prices up 20%. God bless you. In Canada, the difference between disposable income and house prices is astronomical. The inflation that we've seen in our real economy has not been matched by higher incomes. And I think I've talked about this with you in past podcasts as well. One of the big problems that we don't talk about that is how that erodes corporate competitiveness. Not to turn this into the business community, but we don't think about how this high cost of living is going to erode our ability to attract and retain talent. 90% of our net population growth comes from immigration. How are we going to attract and retain talent if we have this huge spread between the cost of living here and also what's going on in our incomes? The solution to that is not dramatically higher interest rates, because dramatically higher interest rates in Canada is not going to change the conversations in Glasgow. It's not going to change the global dynamic towards having deglobalization and be more self-sufficient. It's not going to change global food dynamics. It's not a panacea for the current environment that hurts us. Is it going to help reduce the bubbliness of housing activity? Absolutely, that'll do it. But please, can we do it slowly so that we don't crush this segment of the economy? So, the problem that we face as Canadians, and I understand that from a political perspective, you can't say this, but maybe we should say this. A lot of what ails Canada is global in nature. And Canadians are being whipsawed by global developments that are happening in China, in Europe, in the United States, that our domestic policy, particularly monetary policy, is not the right tool to address. So it's up to our governments to help take some of the strain off of that, but I think also be honest with us about what's really driving the economy. When the Bank of Canada says they can and they will impact inflation, I crave a policymaker who explains to us we cannot deal with what is happening with China's manufacturing ports. So we're going to be here to make sure that the elements we can control keep you supported over time. I think we deserve that honesty from our policymakers.
But you end up in the bizarre circumstance. Francis, where the countries that are committing to net zero in Glasgow are also currently subsidizing the consumption of gasoline and natural gas in their countries because the prices are too high.
So it's very difficult. And again, why is that happening? Because inflationary increases that we're seeing right now detract from growth. That's the big problem that we see. So it comes back to your question, what are we targeting? Inflation versus growth. And finding that balance is really tricky. And it's not a one-size tool. It's not just interest rates. It's not just a government subsidy program. It has to be all-encompassing. It has to come down to the provincial level as well. That's how we're going to support Canadians through this transition. Now, in the meantime, there are ways to do that. Green bonds. Green bonds are my favorite topic. Why? Right now, in the global government bond environment, you can ask to lend money from global pension funds, global institutional investors that you will pay back with a long lag that's specifically dedicated to green projects or energy transitions. We call these green bonds. 2% of the bonds that Canada is going to give out this year are going to be green bonds. Global investors are clamoring to lend money to countries who are going to invest in green activities. Why? Because it makes our portfolios greener, gives us higher scores, and because our end clients
Is this related to what Carney is doing? Is this related to what Carney's doing?
He has talked about green bonds. A lot of people have talked about green bonds, but we are at a nexus where we can actually be funding transitions in this economy cheaply, because guess what? If you want to borrow from a global pension fund to fuel a green project, they'll actually ask for a lower interest rate than if you ask them to just build a regular old bridge. You get to borrow money for a long time for more cheaply if you say that money is going to go towards a green transition. There's so much demand for this type of activity that in Europe, places like Austria, for example, anywhere in Europe in the past year that offered green bonds were actually oversubscribed. They didn't have enough green bonds for the people that were asking, yeah, I really want to lend money to you. Do you hear anyone saying, you know what, Canada, everyone's saying right now, oh, Canada, no one's going to lend money to us. Interest rates are going to skyrocket. Well, they will lend money to us if we're investing in green projects over time. So what we have to do is say there's an opportunity here where the landscape is changing. We can be at the forefront. There are global investors who are absolutely frothing at the mouth to give us money to engage in this green transition. It's one of the first times in my career where what's right for the country is also going to be what's profitable for the country. Those two things coming together right now is a beautiful moment in our history, but we have to grasp onto it. So in the past, I've heard the excuse like, oh, well, how are we going to pay for it? There's a very clear solution to how we're going to pay for a green transition that helps Canadians. And it's by asking to borrow the money. And I guarantee you there's going to be an insatiable thirst from global investors to give it to us.
Wow, awesome. What a positive note to end on. Thank you for finding a positive note. Thank you for finding a positive note to end on it. And thank you for taking the time to do this. Really fun and I think really helped explain how inflation manifests itself as a public policy here in the country. So
well,
thanks.
Like
it's always so much fun to talk to you.
My view is not everyone's view, so definitely check out. The banks have economics websites. Go take a look. Follow people on Twitter. Get a sense of what's happening. I have a TED Talk on this. Everybody is an economist at heart, and you know more about the economy than you think you do. Get engaged. Because I think this is a time when the economy is infecting all of us on an individual level, and we have a right to understand what's going on.
If you happen to run into Jeff Molson on the street, give him a piece of my mind, would you?
All right.
Thanks. All right. Thank you, Herle Burlyites, for listening. Frances Donald, so interesting. We're so lucky to have her. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsors, CN Rail and the Ontario Real Estate Association. Listen, everybody, we'll be back next week with some more scintillating talk about public policy here on the Herle Burly. Frances Donald, always welcome on the Herle Burly. Take care.